Okay, we are now streaming. So, Mr. Brock, yet again, can we go on the record, please? Good morning. Today is the 8th evidentiary hearing of the Massachusetts Energy Facilities Siting Board. In docket EFSB 22-01, Eversource Energy's Certificate of Environmental Impact and Public Interest for the East Eagles substation. Good morning and welcome, everyone. To start, I want to explain how to use Zoom today to ensure that everyone can fully participate in this public comment hearing, in this public evidentiary hearing from the start. We have interpreters who will be translating from English to Spanish and Spanish to English. To select your desired language, click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and select English or Spanish so that you can hear everything said today with interpretation as needed. I will give you a moment so you can do that. For audio-only participation, attendees can dial in at 646-558-8656, which is not a toll-free number, and then enter the webinar ID 836-9233-7532. Simultaneous English to Spanish and Spanish to English interpretation will be provided. Please do not check the box that says mute original audio. We recommend this so you can still hear the voice of the speaker faintly in the background, but mostly you will hear the voice of the interpreter. Dial-in participants will hear the speaker's voice without interpretation, as Zoom does not offer interpretation for dial-in participants. However, all comments made by dial-in participants on this number will be interpreted into Spanish or English. And one of our interpreters today is going to repeat the instructions I just gave in Spanish.
I am not hearing our interpreters reading the instructions.
No, but I know they are both on.
Donna, earlier, I think, yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much.
I think we would like to get those instructions just in case if anyone has selected the wrong channel.
Thank you. My name is Donna Sharkey. I'm the presiding officer in this proceeding, and I am conducting today's evidentiary hearing. As part of the bench today are other members of the Siting Board staff: Andrew Green, Director of the Siting Board, Joan Evans, General Counsel, and Wayne Wong, Siting Analyst. Please note that this hearing is being recorded by our stenographers, and video recordings of both the English and Spanish streams will be posted to the Siting Board's YouTube channel for viewing. Please remember our guidelines to use in speaking at this evidentiary hearing. There is a court reporter participating remotely who will transcribe everything said during this hearing. As we are all relying on internet connections or telephones to participate, we could experience some technical problems. Please speak slowly and clearly to allow a speaker to finish speaking before you begin speaking, and to pay attention to the video of the person speaking and my video. I will raise my hand as a sign on my video if I need to interrupt the person currently speaking to ask them to stop. Today, we will resume with the presentation of the witnesses by CLF and Green Roots of Mr. Brian Chi and the panel witnesses of Roseanne Bongiovanni, John Walkie, and Sandra Ailman Nijar. Are there any matters people need to bring up before we begin with the presentation of those witnesses? In that case, Mr. Turner, would you like to present your witnesses to be sworn?
Yes, thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. One person from the panel is not on yet, so my proposal, if the board finds it acceptable, would be to swear in and introduce Mr. Chi, and then move to the panel later. Is that acceptable?
That's fine, Mr. Turner. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll call to the virtual witness stand Mr. Chi for swearing in. Thank you.
Mr. Chi, can you raise your right hand so it can be seen in your video? Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth in this proceeding?
I do.
Thank you. You may proceed, Mr. Turner.
Thank you. Please state your name and title for the record.
Brian Chi, Principal Electrical Engineer for GDT Engineering.
Please state your business address.
24 Browning Road, Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, 01545.
Please state the length of time you have worked with your organization.
GDT Engineering was founded in 2018. I have been practicing as an electrical engineer for more than 10 years.
Was the testimony filed by CLF and Green Roots prepared by you and/or under your supervision?
Yes.
Do you have any changes to your testimony?
No.
Do you adopt the direct testimony that bears your name as if you had testified fully and orally thereto today?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chi. The witness is available.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Does the bench have questions for Mr. Chi?
I have one line of questioning, Ms. Sharkey, if I could.
Please proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chi.
Morning.
I asked the same question to the company, and I wanted to hear from you as well. So could I refer you to your pre-filed testimony at page 6, lines 8 to 10, please?
Okay.
Yep. So in these lines, Mr. Chi, you talked about magnetic field studies and their impacts. Have you had a chance to look at the existing magnetic field study by the company?
Yes.
Thank you. And so therefore, could you explain to the bench, based off of your knowledge of the existing field study, magnetic field study, and also your statement that more should be done to identify potential EMF and effects on the city of Boston occupants and safety communication equipment. So,
and I'm sorry, city of Boston occupants and what?
And communication and safety equipment. So I would like you to explain what additional information you believe the company should evaluate in order to get those impacts.
First of all, I'm not an EMF expert. I'm an electrical engineer, to say. My scope of work is to basically evaluate the potential impacts for the substation and location. I would defer that. I wouldn't know what kind of study that they need to perform to make sure that there's no impact to the police station's security communication system. That's something that Eversource should understand and test it out to know the impact.
Thank you, Mr. Chi. That's all I have for now, Ms. Sharkey. Does anyone on the bench have further questions?
Sorry, in that case, do any of the other parties have questions for Mr. Chi?
Mass DEP has no questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hopper.
Residents group does not have any questions.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien.
The company does not either.
Thank you. In that case, Mr. Turner, unless you have any redirect, I believe Mr. Chi is excused.
I have no redirect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for appearing today, Mr. Chi. We appreciate it, and you're excused from today's hearing.
Thank you. Nice to meet everyone.
Mr. Turner, is your missing panelist available?
At the moment, no. Unfortunately, Madam Presiding Officer. We could perhaps take we're trying to reach her. We could perhaps take a brief pause and make one other attempt, but I don't want to hold up the proceedings.
Sure. Why don't we take a 5-minute break, come back at 10:17, you can let me know if you've been able to get them on, or how we should proceed.
Thank you for your patience.
Okay, off the record. Why don't we go back on the record?
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. The third panelist is supposed to be logging in now, so I'm waiting for her to show up on the panelist list any moment. I appreciate the board's patience, all the patience, and all the parties' patience. Mr. Chi's examination was a little shorter than I had anticipated.
That's fine. While we're waiting, Mr. O'Brien. I just wanted to let you know that I anticipate shortly issuing a ruling on your motion to incorporate the materials for the NOI proceeding.
Yes, thank you, Presiding Officer, and we look forward to that. And we know there's an work involved here, which we acknowledge by everybody. I can also, if I may, just provide an administrative update on another thread of our proceedings.
Would that be with regard to your last remaining witness?
No, in fact,
Okay, which I know we had discussed on Friday.
yes, with the company's accommodation. Very briefly, the issue came up about the BPDA and whether it was going to comment on the Chapter 91, and I don't think we're going to be able to turn something around. And given we would have to reopen the record, which would be its own issue. So I think for now we will take up our issues with the city separately and not try to sort of bring it back in here. I just wanted to close that line of issue.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. O'Brien. So Mr. Phelps, Mr. Turner, sorry. It looks like your additional witnesses is now on. If she could just rename herself for the purposes of the video.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, you should find the button in the upper right of your panel there, and if you could just rename it, that would be great. While you're doing that, I'll ask Roseanne Bongiovanni, John Walkie, and Sandra Alamani-Jar to come to the virtual witness stand for swearing in. And I thank you, John and Roseanne. I see your cameras are on.
Thank you. If the witnesses could raise their right hand so it's visible in the screen, thank you. Do you solemnly swear to tell?
We on the record? I'm sorry, Donna, to interrupt. I don't think we're on the record.
I think
Yes, we are.
Alan put us back on the record.
My apology.
That's
Thank you.
okay.
And before you do this, I see our third witness is not, the mute is on. So I just want to make sure that Ms. Alamani-Jar, you turn the mute off so we can hear your response to the swearing in.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. I'm so sorry.
Can you raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth in this proceeding?
I do.
Thank you. Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. I'll do one witness at a time. So we'll start with you, Ms. Bongiovanni. Please state your name and title for the record.
My name is Roseanne Bongiovanni. I'm the Executive Director of Green Roots.
And please state your business address.
Presently at 227 Marginal Street, Suite 1 in Chelsea, Massachusetts.
And how long have you worked with Green Roots?
Since inception, I'm the founding executive director, so 6 years.
Was the testimony filed by CLF and Green Roots prepared by you and or under your supervision?
Yes, it was.
Do you have any changes to your testimony?
I do not.
And do you adopt the direct testimony that bears your name as if you had testified fully and orally thereto today?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Mr. Walkie, please state your name and title.
John Walkie. I'm the Director of Waterfront and Climate Justice Initiatives at Green Roots.
And how long have you worked with Green Roots?
It's been about 5-6 years.
Was the testimony filed by CLF and Green Roots prepared by you and or under your supervision?
Yes.
Do you have any changes to your testimony?
No.
Do you adopt the direct testimony that bears your name as if you had testified fully and orally thereto today?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Alamani-Jar, please state your name and title. Sorry, just your name.
Sandra Alemán-Nijar,
And please state your address.
137 Saratoga Street, East Boston, Mass. 02128.
Thank you. Was the testimony filed by CLF and Green Roots prepared by you and or under your supervision?
Yes.
Do you have any changes to your testimony?
No.
And do you adopt the direct testimony that bears your name as if you had testified fully and orally thereto today?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. The witness panel is available for questioning.
Thank you. Do any of the parties have questions for the panel of witnesses?
Ask the EP has no questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hopper. Mr. O'Brien?
Yes, we do have a number of questions. If the panel is ready, we're ready to proceed.
The floor is yours, Mr. O'Brien.
Yes, thank you. Hi, good morning, panel. I'd like, if I may, just to start briefly by asking the panel to describe the experience of living in an environmental justice community, just as context and background, addressing things like housing or the COVID, the impacts of the airport as they're experienced by residents day to day.
Sure, maybe I'll start off in terms of an environmental justice community. I live in East Boston, and a large amount of the impacts that we feel on a day-to-day basis are mainly from Logan Airport. The area of East Boston is about 5 square miles, and about 3 of that is taken up by the airport property. And then of what remains, there's a good chunk of property that's taken up by services to the airport, whether it's rental car centers, fuel terminals that serve that jet fuel. So that rules out a lot of other kinds of land uses, including housing. And of course, in East Boston, we have very much an affordable housing crush that's affecting a lot of our neighbors, especially low income and communities of color, immigrant community that we work with mostly. And then, of course, the legacy of sort of industrial uses of oil terminals, of salvage marine scrap yards, shipping and such on the waterfront has left its own industrial legacy, which we saw at the subject site that needed to be remediated. All of that is something that we live with daily, but probably one of the biggest issues is, the neighborhood of East Boston has the lowest canopy cover, and when we're looking for places to plant trees, it's getting fewer and farther between those opportunities. So land is a pretty precious commodity, and with sea level rise, as Mark Twain said, buy land because they're not making more of it. We made lots of it in years past in Boston, and we're losing it now as sea level goes up. So for the land that remains, an opportunity for a park, an opportunity for open space is pretty critical. And during COVID, we saw how important it was for our communities to have places to go, to have green space, to get out of the house. People are pretty tightly packed. When we looked at the highest COVID rates in the city of Boston, it overlaid exactly with measures of overcrowding and housing. So those two things go hand in hand, the health impacts and the living conditions that we have. And all of those are the kinds of variables that define an environmental justice community. And Rosie can probably speak a bit more to Chelsea side of things.
Thank you, John. Yes, thank you for the question, Mr. O'Brien. I'm a lifelong Chelsea resident and didn't necessarily know that there was water in Chelsea until I was 18 or 19. It's not that I didn't know that there was water in Chelsea, but we had such limited access to the waterfront that I didn't recognize the fact that Chelsea is surrounded by water on 3 sides. We're essentially a peninsula by the Mill Creek, Chelsea Creek, Mystic River, and Island End River. And the fact that I didn't even recognize that until I was almost 20 years old was attributed to the fact that much of the waterfront has been barred from residents of our communities, Chelsea and East Boston. 100% of the jet fuel that's used at Logan Airport is stored along the banks of the Chelsea Creek. 70 to 80% of the region's heating fuel, gasoline and ethanol for hundreds of thousands of gas stations up and down the mid-Atlantic coast are all along the banks of the Chelsea Creek. Rock salt that is used to de-ice the roadways for more than 350 communities is stored along the banks of the Chelsea Creek. And when I was growing up, there were additional oil storage facilities in Chelsea and East Boston. The Hess site, the Amoco site, the Northeast Petroleum tank farm, the Coastal Oil asphalt storage facility. And the remaining locations along the waterfront were all airport related, as John described, that parking lots, freight forwarding companies, major trucking industries, and Chelsea is home to the second largest produce distribution center in the nation, home to the Tobin Bridge, and in East Boston, as John outlined, East Boston is home to Logan International Airport. So our 2 communities are low income, very densely populated communities. Pre-COVID, we had 24% of our residents in Chelsea and 17% in East Boston that fell below the poverty levels. Our 2 communities are also 2 of the communities with the highest number of folks with limited English proficiency. And as John described, very densely populated. And so these 2 communities are really shouldering the burden for much of New England for all of these critical infrastructure needs for New England. The low-income folks and communities of color in our 2 neighborhoods are really shouldering the burden for all of New England. And we continue to be called upon to do more and more. And so living in Chelsea and East Boston feels very complicated, as John explained. I'm raising my 2 children in Chelsea. I've chosen to do that because this is my community. I love this community. But there isn't a day that goes by that we don't worry about air quality, respiratory illnesses, lack of tree canopy cover in Chelsea and East Boston, the number of pollution sources, and we continue to be dumped on, as you likely saw in the news. The state dumped cancer-causing asbestos in our neighborhood. And so that's not uncommon. It's a daily basis that the state and private industries continue to see Chelsea and East Boston and other environmental justice communities as dumping grounds. And so it's a constant battle. We're always fighting not for, to protect our forests and our waterfronts, but really to protect the health and well-being of our community members who have been sacrificed and sacrificial lambs, if you will, for decades on end. Just to close out, I'll say that Chelsea had one of the highest rates of COVID infections in the Northeast. You also likely saw in the news that we had 6 times the state's rate of COVID infections throughout much of 2020. And East Boston was the neighborhood that was hardest hit by COVID for much of 2020. Again, to densely populated, low-income, ethnically diverse communities with limited English proficiency.
Thank you. I do want to ask Sandra a similar question, but before we do that, I'd like to introduce or frame the next series of questions within a line of inquiry that Ms. Evans brought up with Penn Low. And I just wanted to provide the reference for everybody so they can scroll to it if they care to. It's from the Tuesday, I think it was the 21st, page 944. And I'll read that in a moment, but before I do that, I do want to first state for the record that Sandra has signed every petition associated with this substation, and that I think it's important to state that for the record. So thank you, Sandra. Do you have anything to add to what John and Ms. Bongiovanni just stated? Just from your own personal experience.
Apologize, I'm here running the soup kitchen at the same time, so I'm a little bit multitasking. No, I think everything you said, it is what it is. I am going to continue. I am committed to this. I call it fight because I'm fighting for my life and for my family and my neighbors' lives. So I will not let go. Because it's our lives that depends on this substation. And I hope that you understand that. And I really hope that you find it in your heart to understand the fear that will be in our lives every single day by having a substation right by the water. So this is why I will continue to be here, and I will continue to fight it, and I will continue to do whatever that is in my power to resist it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Najjar. So if I may, I'd like to read the exchange between Ms. Evans and Penn Low, and then ask the panel to talk about the specific site, the proposed East Eagle substation location and the surrounding land uses. So the question was, and this, I'll try to read it pretty much exactly. I'll skip a few points, but so you were, and this is a question from Ms. Evans to Penn Low. So you were talking about the difference of the impacts between building a substation on the site versus, say, a soccer field. And I'm interested in whether it's your view that the siting board has an obligation to look at a site and consider any other possible uses of that site versus the proposal that's in front of us to build a particular type of facility. That could become very broad and unwieldy in our review of a facility, as you're aware in our review. And then Penn Low responds, yes, I appreciate that question. Certainly, I'm not suggesting that the siting board become a de facto land use planning agency. However, there are other places for that. However, I think what I'm suggesting is that if we're trying to find more open space and recreation that a community is already pursuing, and the site of interest could have an impact its future, then I think it's
I'm sorry,
appropriate.
I'm sorry, I can't understand you. Find more open space and recreation that a community is already pursuing.
Yes, and the site of interest could have an impact on that future. Then I think it's very appropriate for the siting board to consider the impacts of that site versus other uses that the community may be pursuing. So the conversation and the exchange continues, but leaving it there first, and this is an important point raised by Ms. Evans and in this exchange. So if the panel could briefly talk about the history of the site and the surrounding area and why the panel may believe it's relevant for the siting board to consider that history as it evaluates the proposal that's now in front of the board.
Sure. I can speak to what I know of the history of the site, having worked down here for the past 16 years or so. When I first moved into East Boston, there was the property was vacant. It was actually a couple of different properties. It wasn't all under the heading of the city at that point. Eventually, the city took possession of all these vacant lots that were left just kind of underused for multiple years. And I think we submitted with a testimony the various open space plans. The city repeatedly referred to these properties as areas to potentially address a lot of the lack of open space within East Boston. A lot of what I've already discussed. This property was considered a potential to address that. The nearby Urban Wild, Condo Street Urban Wild, actually our organization had partnered with other groups in East Boston to work on getting that park established. That had been a brownfield, tremendously contaminated, and sitting out there on the waterfront, and it became the first waterfront access point. And in the process of establishing that park, that Urban Wild, and obviously with the long existing American Legion field across the street, there was some concern for residents that there wasn't enough at this point in time. We're talking back around 2000, early 2000s. There was some concern over having more of a presence of officials down there, of authority of some sort. And for many years, there was the desire to have what they called sort of a public safety facility, meaning a police bay, an EMS, like an ambulance bay, and maybe a fire apparatus, of just having some sign of municipal investment in the community down in that corner. Over the years, that sort of desire turned into what has now become the moving of the entire police station over there, which I'm not sure was exactly what people had in mind, but it's there. It's been constructed on the corner. And so it looked as if it would make a lot of sense to have some sort of a waterfront access of some sort in there. And that's when in 2000, a little before 2014, started the wheels turning on this land use decision of putting in a substation in this area. And it's been batted around a bit from one side of the property to the other for different reasons. And within that process, there was at some point the city's idea, and I think in the record there are some designs of how they could try to squeeze in a soccer field in there. We do know there's been over the years, it's a traditional sort of source of contention between newcomer immigrant communities and then longtime families that have kids playing baseball, of competing for the American Legion field for either of those two sports. There are leagues that go in there to play soccer that come from all around the region, from Danvers and Middleton and other places come in to play soccer in these areas against local teams. So the area gets heavily used, and the idea of having an additional soccer field on the waterfront, I think, was appealing, because that is the kind of waterfront use that is not dangerous or heavily damaged if it gets flooded. So the thought was having something like open space or a recreational field on the waterfront would be a valuable thing. Additionally, in 2015, I believe it was the end of 2015, the Army Corps of Engineers recognized that the shoreline of that property, what we generally call the city yards property, was eroding, that the twice daily 9 to 10 foot fluctuations of the tide, not even talking about sea level rise or climate change, but just the regular tidal action was eroding the landfill that was there and exposing a sewer main. And so they were working with the city, and that project still goes on, but that is, it was considered an emergency stream bank protection project. Of course, that was in 2015, and the 30-day notice of this emergency thing has gone on now since then. So, but it was recognized that there's erosion going on in the front of this property. So there's a very old CSO that was part of, I think, the discussion in the underlying proceedings, the EFSB 014 or whatever the number was, but the 2014 proceedings. There was some discussion of the very old CSO that is in the gully between where the substation was originally proposed and the channel fish facility. That still has not been really addressed, that CSO. It needs some maintenance, needs to be replaced. So there's, that's sort of the history and the context of that site. The DPW is currently in there, and the waterfront section of it has not been addressed. And obviously the remediation that Eversource has engaged in has taken place, and the site sort of sits there. The various drafts of plans that were presented to the community in terms of the police station actually never had the gasoline pumps on the drawings. We've never saw that until it was actually built. So it was kind of a surprise to see gas pumps right up near the fence of the substation. But again, it's more of a question of the city having talked about this property in one context of what it was slated to be. And obviously it's not written in stone. And so the plans shifted, the plans changed, a deal was cut. And I think from the community's perspective, they felt rather shut out of the negotiations on that when they occurred back in 2013 or 12 or somewhere in there.
Yeah, Ms. O'Brien has testified and introduced evidence for a lot of that, but thank you, John. If there's
Brian, could I add to what?
Yeah, of course, please go right ahead.
I think what's critically important, going back to the line of questioning that you were referring to between Ms. Evans and Professor Penlow, I think what's critically important for the EFSB's role is to consider the cost of this substation and where that cost, when they're looking at the siting of substations like this, what the cost of those substations are and who is paying for the cost of that. And so I believe that we've seen over the course of the last 10 years or so that Eversource has continued to push for the substation to be in this location and has clearly racked up expensive legal fees throughout all of these proceedings, as well as mitigation and remediation. And they've, pointed to the community benefits agreements that they've signed with various organizations as sort of goodwill, if you will. And yet all of those costs are being roped into or included in the final project cost of the substation, which will only be paid out by taxpayers. It's not like these costs will be paid by Eversource. The end folks who are paying for this are all of us and many more. So I think what's critically important when we're looking at these sites and where they could or should go, the EFSB's role is also to consider how significant the costs are and how all of those costs are being paid out by the ratepayers. I think what's also critically important for the EFSB as they're looking at locations like this is just to what Sandra mentioned earlier, the proximity of this critical infrastructure next to, as we stated earlier, very densely populated neighborhoods. And as John pointed out, public parks that are very heavily utilized. We've seen several fires at substations. One as recent as last week in Newton, where there was a worker who was badly burned and was hospitalized. And so I think it's important for the EFSB when they're looking at infrastructure like this and sites, they need to take into consideration the proximity to neighborhoods and the impact that catastrophic fires could also have on adjacent neighborhoods and what that might mean for dozens and dozens of old stock 3-family homes in East Boston. So I think those two pieces are critically important. The cost of infrastructure like this, the proximity to sensitive populations, and I would lastly say that I think that the EFSB needs to, their role should really be determining how needed this is. And I think that we've yet to hear a solid argument from Eversource stating that this is actually needed. Again, we're in almost year 10 here. And for 10 years, Eversource has been saying, this is doomsday, this year's doomsday, it's coming, it's doomsday. And here we are 10 years later and not yet having seen doomsday. Thank you, Mr. O'Brien.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Bongiovanni. I do want to just give a little bit of a framework of where a few more lines of inquiry go, just so everyone can sort of have a sense of what's ahead. So I want to talk briefly, or ask the panel to talk briefly about the extent to which you understand that Massport may be one of the drivers of the projected load. This was a line of inquiry that Mr. Green started at the last session we had. I also like to talk briefly about the mitigation agreements that exist. And then finally, to conclude with the question that Mr. Green asked Senator Edwards about assuming the forecasts are correct, what doesn't the reliability of electricity have a very significant role in consideration of the substation? I'm going to mute for a second because there's a very loud noise outside. Please forgive me for just a moment. Thank you. So to the extent the panel can comment, can the panel provide any sense of what proportion of load Massport is contributing to the projected future total load that would justify the substation if needed?
So, Mr. Rosenzweig, you unmuted.
Thank you, Mr. Walkie. I do know that Green Roots was allowed access to some confidential information that's subject to an NDA. This would not be the opportunity to discuss any of that confidential information if I'm not clear what Mr. Walkie or Ms. Bongiovanni's testimony may be, but I would sort of raise a provisional sort of not objection, but provisional note that we need to be very careful here with any specifics that may have been adduced from the confidential information that was shared with Green Roots and the non-disclosure agreement that was signed with them. So answer the question as you may choose, but I would suggest more in the nature of generalities would be appropriate.
I appreciate the cautionary word. I would say I would refer back to then the conversation from Mr. Green, where we were speaking. There was an information request to discuss this issue of the proportionality of Massport contribution to the demand in this load pocket in generalities, in a general term that could be shared. And I think that we had sort of finished that by saying that it was substantial without actually saying amounts. And we await what that actual information response, how you guys want to actually word it. But from our perspective, we see Logan Airport, as I think has been referred to, as the elephant in the room, or the 400-pound gorilla, or whatever animal you want to define it as. But obviously, relative to cumulative impacts on a community, the airport has a lot. And I think the whole point of the climate bill that has that EJ, environmental justice language in it, was to address the issue that we are not really addressing those facts, that there are facilities that have huge impacts, and these impacts quite frequently get cut up and segmented into pieces. So obviously the airport has a large impact in terms of its noise. That's the obvious one that everyone in East Boston and Winthrop complains about. Pollution, air pollution is another one that is a tough one epidemiologically to really link, but it's there. But then beyond that, traffic, ground traffic, meaning the infrastructure that supports that ground traffic, freight forwarding and such that goes through the airport, and then land use decisions, basically the amount of land that is taken up by the airport, we've already mentioned. But then Massport does not want to be seen as being that elephant trampling through the neighborhood. So frequently there are third parties that are supporting the airport, and they put in the infrastructure necessary for the airport to do its thing and to make its money. There is no analysis at this point in time of the cumulative impact of the airport on the community, whether that's in terms of noise, air pollution, land use, traffic, all of that. It's just not done. And this, unfortunately for Eversource, this project, from our perspective, appears to be another one of these handmaidens to Logan Airport, more so than to the community. The numbers can be debated and behind closed doors, but in general, when we've discussed the need, it's been kind of disconcerting. Obviously, the people who understand the need for the grid and the grid the best are the people proposing this project. I mean, and as long as information does remain behind NDAs, it's very hard for a third party to evaluate that. However, when we've discussed in the proceedings here in the past few days, several days, when we've discussed things like solar, the idea that solar exists without battery storage, that distributed generation is just negligible, that the only way battery storage works is if it's charged off the grid. Assumptions like that obviously favor one perspective and one argument, and we're not really getting a full airing of what is the grid going to look like in the future. The substations that we're putting in, we've heard a lot about their design, and they're very advanced in terms of fire suppression and all these things. But they are not actually all that much different than the substation that Mr. Zico had mentioned that had been in operation for 100 years. These are things that take high voltage electricity and step it down to lower voltage distribution. The question the other night, I broke out the candles because our electricity went out just a night before giving testimony here today. And they were around the corner from my house in a manhole trying to fix something down there. That has nothing to do with a substation. That's something to do with the distribution network. I feel as if there might be more of a discussion to be had, maybe not in this venue, but definitely somewhere, that our distribution network and our grid needs investments, like a $60 million investment that might not include the same way we've done things for 100 years. It might need things like distributed generation that can take off the demand, and it does have the capacity to do that. I feel a lot of our discussion has gone around and around with those issues, non-wire alternatives, and just has kind of waved hands over them. We know from ISO New England and their estimates from the beginning of this process, we looked at their estimates for demand, and they were way off because energy efficiency was performing far better than they expected. We can expect the same, I think, in a lot of these other technologies as they're moving forward. And in the end, the demand for a large chunk of electricity suddenly coming into the neighborhood, it could be, in my opinion, much more so needed by a facility such as Logan Airport. And if, according to many of the distribution and transmission experts, you want to site your substation as close to the demand load as possible, it would make a whole lot of sense to locate it on Logan Airport property then, because I would contend that that is where your demand load is really coming from. And in the years to come, we're going to see demand actually decrease in the residential areas as people increasingly put on solar panels, have battery storage, have demand control, becomes more and more of something you do on a smart, like those home heating, thermostats and things you control by your phone. Electricity demand will go down within the residential setting. Plugging in a large airplane when it comes into dock from an international flight, that probably isn't going to change in the next several years. That's going to need a lot of electricity. And if that's where the demand is, then the agency that has been responsible for taking away, for providing such a cumulative burden on this community should also now be the one to take on this burden rather than the neighborhood.
Could I just lodge somewhat of an objection going forward? Mr. O'Brien's question was very broad, and I do appreciate Mr. Walkie sort of trying to walk the tightrope on any disclosure issues, but the inquiry from Boston Residents Group is limited to damage to the environment. With a broad question, it leaves itself open to the witness rightly saying whatever he or she feels is responsive to that question. But to the extent it represents cross-examination, the cross-examination from Boston Residents Group can't be used to elicit information that goes beyond damage to the environment. Let's say includes need issues or alternatives issues, solar, batteries, or even alternative siting locations. So I don't want to move to strike what Mr. Walkie said because it was fair in that regard, but I am now going to sort of follow more rigorously and would ask that Mr. O'Brien follow more rigorously the limited scope with which their party status was granted so that the answers that come from witnesses are limited to that scope, that being damage to the environment.
Yes, presiding officer, I'm happy to reply briefly, but we have a new line of inquiry, which I think will be a way to resolve that by just not asking any more questions about this.
Why don't you perhaps clarify your intent, Mr. O'Brien?
Yes, certainly. So this question has come up. In other words, what's the framework of the environmental damage to which we acknowledge we're constrained, and how does that fit into the total range of issues that are in front of the siting board? And in brief, and we've thought a lot about this, and we completely respect the framework. Obviously, we want to extend it reasonably, but our position, I think, is as follows: that the issue of need, strictly speaking, is not within our purview, but questions of possible alternatives, and understanding that many of these have been decided previously, alternative options which mitigate or reduce environmental damage, cumulative and individual, are within our framework. And then following that, in the briefing phase, a lot of these questions will be illuminated. That is to say, even though some of our questions may be on the borderline of sort of out of bounds, during the briefing, we're going to very focus strictly on environmental matters. So that's the general framing of how we're looking at it.
I would have to disagree with you, Mr. O'Brien, on your scope. I think you at least the way we would interpret it, and based on the law, the statutes, and the siting board's precedent, is where your intervention is not as a general matter under Chapter 30A, it's subject to a more limited section 30A, 10A, Section 10A. There's very clear case law on damage to the environment. And you cannot use some of these economic issues or need-related issues or alternative siting issues as a backdoor to go beyond the scope of your intervention. That would be our position. And if anything, I've been, in my mind, perhaps too permissive there and allowed things to go on so that you can have your say. But at this late date, at this stage of the hearing, going forward, I'm going to be more involved in your questioning if you ask questions so broad that the witness sees it as an opportunity through friendly cross-examination to expand the scope of what really should be the proper development of the record at this stage of the process.
Yes, I think those, we don't disagree with what's just been stated. And we do only have a very few more questions. So I think the opportunities will not be coming up for applying the stricter framework. So if I may, I'll just continue with our few more questions.
And Mr. Rosenzweig will no doubt interject to the extent he needs to.
Yes, so thank you. So just to focus on questions of damage to the environment and mitigation, therefore, I'd like to turn briefly to the question of the agreement with which the company entered into with Eagle Hill Civic Association and the Boys and Girls Club. And so my first question to the panel would be, are any of you involved with the Eagle Hill Civic Association?
Yes, I've long been a resident member and have recently, in the past couple of years, gone on to the board of the Eagle Hill Civic Association.
And Ms. Bongiovanni?
I am not a member of the Eagle Hill Civic Association.
And Sandra?
I am a member.
Ms. Najjar, thank you.
Yes, I am a member.
And for those that are in a position to answer, how did that association decide to sign the community benefits agreement with Eversource?
So again, I'm not seeing how that decision by the Eagle Hill Civic Association to execute an agreement represents an inquiry into damage to the environment.
Fair. Thank you. What is the association's position on the East Boston substation?
The association, in full disclosure, I was on the board when that agreement came up, and I recused myself from it and did not vote on it because the people on the board knew I was, in a fight against the proposal. And I told them that, I've chosen which hill I'm going to die on. Doesn't mean you have to go do the same. That if they wanted to sign an agreement to get something out of it, they should get something out of it for the community. They should do that. We did do a survey, an online survey of asking people what they wanted to see to get an idea of what kind of mitigation, and a number of the responses, I don't have the numbers, but said that they did not want a substation at all. But if we're going to get one, let's have some trees. That was, I think, some people said trees, some people said we want solar panels on all our houses, or whatever. There were different ideas of what they wanted to get from mitigation.
Can I add to that? I think what I've understood from Representative Madero is that, and John, I think that you could probably talk more about this, is that from the perspective of the members of the Eagle Hill Civic Association, they felt as though they were almost forced into signing a community benefits agreement because they felt as though they weren't certain if this substation would be stopped or not. And so it would be better to get at least something from the neighborhood, for the neighborhood, rather than nothing, because they knew without a community benefits agreement, Eversource wouldn't just come in and plant a whole bunch of trees and plant a new park and clean up the air and improve the environment, but that they needed to sign a community benefits agreement to try and get something in the case, or in the instance that the substation was to move forward. Is that correct, John? Sorry.
Yeah, no, that would basically sum up what I think people's attitudes were. I think Representative Madro has mentioned on more than one occasion that he's raising his children here. They're going to use that park, the same park that he used growing up in, and he would rather there not be a substation across the street from it.
The similar two questions with respect to the Boys and Girls Club, the Salation Boys and Girls Club. Are any of you involved with the Salation Boys and Girls Club?
I am not.
Nor am I.
Sandra, Ms. Najjar?
Yes, they are partners of our organization, the Soup Kitchen.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
do you know what is the club's position on the East Boston substation?
Again, I have the same objection that I raised with regard to that question as it relates to the Eagle Hill Civic Association. Mr. O'Brien, if you could, for my preference, and just to expedite things so you could finish up your line without me interrupting, I would suggest you go right to sort of the meat of what you want to ask these witnesses in a direct question.
Sure, thank you. And I'm right there. So with your knowledge of cumulative environmental impacts in East Boston, would you say that these benefits provided through these two agreements are proportional and have a nexus, a reasonable connection with the impacts you've observed, both generally and that you would anticipate from the substation were to be built?
No, I mean, speaking directly and just specifically to environmental impact, we are talking about a few trees planted down along the edge of this property, which are nice, but are not really going to replace the fact of what could have been on that property had it not been taken up with a substation. And I know we have had testimony on environmental impact in terms of the benefit of the remediation of the site to the tune of 4.6 or somewhere thereabouts $1 million. And just want to reiterate a little bit of what I believe Ms. Bongiovanni has mentioned, that these mitigation costs, these community benefits agreements, all of these things are better termed no bid contracts, because the ratepayers are actually paying for this. So it's coming out of our pockets. It's not coming out of Eversource's pocket. We are paying for the remediation. And in fact, the more remediation there is, because of the nature of how the regulations are set up, which you all know better than I, there's a 12% profit or somewhere around there, a little less maybe. So all of these things contribute to the total price of this project, the total cost, of which a percentage of which is going to be profit for shareholders. So the more remediation there is, the more mitigation there is, the more HVAC systems purchased for a Boys and Girls Club, the more actual profit will go to the company, and actually the more the ratepayers will be paying for that, including the ratepayers in East Boston. So we're paying for our own mitigation, which seems to me not the definition of mitigation.
And just to talk from the perspective of Chelsea, to sort of complement what John just said, in Chelsea, we've partnered both with the city of Chelsea and the State Department of Conservation and Recreation to plant over 2,000 trees in our own community. And there are lots of opportunities to plant trees. We just planted 50 trees a month ago in Chelsea on one block. And so I don't know all of the details of the CBAs with both of the individual organizations, but that isn't something that community members couldn't have done on their own to improve our own neighborhoods, right? We could have gotten grants and done this with some state resources. We don't necessarily need to be grateful to Eversource for planting a few trees at the cost of a $60+ million project and the health and well-being of our neighborhoods.
Thank you. So I'd like, if I may, just in coming very close to the end here, to go to the question that Mr. Green raised to a number of prior panelists, but I'll just focus when the exchange with Senator Edwards. And just for everyone's reference, it's the page 836, and I'll start with line 12 and 13 and just read it to you, and then ask for to answer, if you would, the same question. I'd like you to at least begin with a hypothetical that the company's forecast is correct or could be correct, and that there may be the potential for an outage under the defined conditions in 2024. If that were to occur on a hot summer day, would you view that as relevant to the consideration of environmental justice issues in the community? So that would be the question, and any response you may have, I'm sure would be helpful.
So again, the question is somewhat broad, but in that it's a question from the Boston Residents Group. I would ask that the witnesses limit their answers to topics that fall into the category of damage to the environment rather than need or other types of issues that green roots or CLF may have more generally. And I would move to strike at this time if their answers go beyond that scope.
Could I simplify the matter just by stating that this might obviate the need to ask the question later from the bench? So perhaps that's relevant to your determination, presiding officer.
Well, I believe that Mr. Rosenzweig is cautioning the witnesses. But I don't believe he has as of yet objected since they haven't given their answers.
And when I'm say cautioning, I am not being critical of these two witnesses. They're answering questions asked of them. I'm just trying to not be in the position of trying to lock the barn door after the horses left the gate, and just setting what I believe is the correct legal context. And so that if I need to follow up later, it's not that I have waived my objection by letting something proceed unwittingly. So
yeah, and we agree if the panel could simply limit it to questions of the damage to the environment under the stated hypothetical, that would be totally within bounds for us. So please, John, Mr. Walkie, and Mr. Bongiovanni, and Sandra, Ms. Nijar.
I guess I tried to traipse the line here. The question itself rules out anything. It's assuming need is there. Having power outages, it affects everyone in a given area, but obviously a given area could be an environmental justice neighborhood. In the heat of the summer, it is communities like ours that are the most vulnerable. There's been a decent amount of media attention on Chelsea in terms of heat island effects and the things that we're doing to try to counteract that. So losing power in the middle of that would be bad. And nobody wants to lose power, and certainly not in the middle of a heat wave where someone might be on ventilators or whatever the scenario is that people want to trot out. The question is how do we prevent that kind of an impact from happening on a community that already has a cumulative burden? And I think that is where there's a discussion, but we won't go into that. In terms of environmental impacts, damage to the environment, a substation is not necessarily damage to the environment unless there is an event that takes place at it. There's a release of sulfur hexafluoride, or there's a release of mineral oil, or it's arcing or something. In terms of the damage to the environment of a substation, it's more a question of it removes a possible other kinds of land use. To the degree that that's damage to the environment, I would view that as the major impact. It rules out, it's the Christmas morning concept. Every one of those packages under the Christmas tree could be anything. A vacant lot could be anything. As soon as you open it up and it's a pair of socks or a substation, there goes your Christmas present. As long as it's unwrapped, as long as it remains a vacant lot, it could become something beneficial to the community. And a substation is beneficial in terms of maintaining electricity. In the case of East Boston, a community that's already so land scarce, the removal of that property is a damage to the environment because there's less open space and less potential for benefit.
Ms. Bongiovanni, do you care to comment?
I don't think that I can beat the socks or a substation comment, so I'll let John take that one. Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Najjar, if you want to comment, that would be great, because you would be a resident for whom this is a meaningful question, I believe. If you care to comment, please do so, limiting it again just to the environment.
I don't really know
I know.
a whole lot in terms of environmental, language, but in terms of the, what, in my opinion, how this substation would make a difference on the power outage in my community, especially during the summer. I mean, for what I know, this substation would be providing energy mostly to the airport, to Massport. So it's not like it's going to be providing so much more to us residents of East Boston. So what difference is it going to really make having this substation in East, right by the water, which we already discussed all the dangers that this electrical plant will bring to us, but it, in terms of providing energy and eliminating the power outage possibilities, I don't really think that this substation will eliminate that problem for us, because again, it's not like they're really providing the services to us mainly. It would be mostly for Massport. So again, like what I've said many times before, take it to Massport, put it in their land. They have a lot of that.
Thank you, Ms. Najjar. That
I-
concludes
okay.
our questions.
I would object to the majority of Ms. Najjar's answer. I don't begrudge her saying that. I'm not surprised she says that, but it is outside the scope, because the question was really based on the hypothetical of that the substation is needed. And her answer really went to whether it's needed and where it should be located, if at all. And so I think he has asked a question that is adduced an answer that's outside the scope of their intervention. And I would ask to strike it.
Mr. Turner, given that it's your witness, would you like to address the
Sure.
question?
Yeah, I want to provide, I don't know if Mr. O'Brien wants an opportunity. Yes, I would like an opportunity to say something. Shall I go first? Or-
That
Yes.
would be helpful.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so the question, Mr. O'Brien, I don't have a live transcript, but I believe he asked a very specific question about the power outages, and asked the witnesses to limit their scope to environmental impacts. What I heard in the answer included things like the substation being located near the water, which I take to suggest possible environmental impacts, and the question of what difference the substation is going to make on a hot summer day for the residents, which is, I think, what the underlying question really got at. And it's more Mr. Green's question, so perhaps it makes more sense ultimately for Mr. Green to pose the question. But I do not see enough to justify striking the witness's answer, in particular because it's coming from one of the potentially impacted residents of East Boston.
Yes, I would agree. A couple of thoughts. First off, it's an important question. I wasn't sure if Mr. Green or anyone else was going to ask it. So I wanted to make sure that this panel had a chance to ask the same question, to answer the same question. The second point I would make is that Ms. Najjar's answer was quite similar to what Senator Edwards answered. And although the question was in a different context, in other words, not strictly limited to the environment,
I'm sorry, Mr. O'Brien, you're breaking up.
Yes, number one, I wasn't sure the question was going to be asked, which is why we asked it. And then the second one was Ms. Najjar's answer was very similar to the answer given by Senator Edwards, although it was not asked within the same limited framework, that is to say, the environment. But I think the witness offered meaningful, direct evidence of how East Boston residents will be affected environmentally, and for that reason would ask that the motion to strike be denied. Thank you.
Just very quickly, I moved to strike. I said the majority of her answer that dealt with the need specific issues, Mr. Turner, I don't disagree with you. To the extent our answer included content that related impacts the environment, I was not seeking to move to strike that. So I'm just going to leave it there, and I've had my say, and I leave it up to the presiding officer.
I think her response had a mix of environmental issues and which is the scope of Mr. O'Brien's intervention. However, it also did understandably address other concerns that she had raised previously in her testimony that are within the scope of CLF and Green Roots intervention. So if you have a specific suggestion, Mr. Rosenzweig, looking at her response as to what you'd like to strike, then I would suggest you file something briefly and we can address it in writing, because I think it's going to be difficult to probably tease this out at this moment of time in the hearing. You're on mute.
That's a fair point. Sorry about that. I do have the live transcript. It's not the official transcript, so I would need to await having the official transcript in order to press our claim any further. So I will just hold at this point, and then we'll make a determination when we see the live transcript.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rosenzweig. Mr. O'Brien, do you have further questions?
Yes, I would like to take the opportunity to ask one further question. It's in view of the time, and we have a little bit of time before a lunch break. So I'll put this to the panel, and subject to any objection, we can proceed briefly. Could the panel please address can the panel please address the question of public interest with respect to protection of the environment and in relationship to the substation, and provide the siting board your perspective, your expert understanding of where the public interest lies in this proceeding relative to protecting the environment in East Boston and Chelsea? And that will be my final question.
Could you restate the question a little bit? I'm trying to figure out exactly where to go.
Sure. So limiting the question to the issue of potential damage to the environment and mitigating or reducing it, can the panel describe where it believes the public interest lies with respect to the substation, the potential substation?
I guess in terms of environmental damage, the public interest would be on, I think, in the realm of what I've already discussed in terms of the opportunity for open space, the opportunity for a benefit to the community as opposed to another burden. But then I think in the public interest in a bigger picture, beyond the neighborhood, is just the idea that if you build something on a beach, what are you thinking in this day and age? People have houses on Plum Island, they get washed out, and when people rebuild, people say, I hope I'm not paying for their insurance. If we're putting critical infrastructure that is supposed to last for a long time on the waterfront, in an area that will flood in the future, I don't understand where that is in the public interest, because in the end, we will have to pay to build it and then pay to repair. Even if it's not a catastrophic, it's just minor damage, we'll be paying to fix the damage as well. And the potential environmental impacts of something going wrong at a substation might be containable. And it seems as if the company is taking measures to try to do that as best they can, anticipating what they can. as Newton and other places have shown, things don't always go according to plan. So the potential for an environmental impact is there, and the potential for having the outages that we don't want to see happen, there's a potential for that to be happening if this were to be impacted by climate change, which it will be. So the public interest would be to not put critical infrastructure in a risky place.
I'd like to just add specifically to the East Boston neighborhood, of all of the hundreds of East Boston residents that we've spoken to, that I've spoken to, that our organization has spoken to, we haven't come across any that have said, yes, we welcome this substation and we want to sacrifice a piece of waterfront open space for this substation. So the public interest in East Boston, I would say, is clearly against the substation. And then more generally, if we look at all of Boston, I think we can tell from the ballot question that was answered, almost a year ago, that approximately 90% of all of Boston, so the public interest of all of those voters, was clearly against the substation and in favor of environmental justice and equity for the East Boston neighborhood. I would say if we went further out, outside of Boston, maybe the public interest for communities that wouldn't want to host this critical infrastructure would say, sure, put it in East Boston. But for other communities that are environmental justice communities that know what it's like to shoulder disproportionate environmental burdens, they would all say this is not fair. And this community has already shared its fair share or disproportionate share of environmental burdens. And so this community actually deserves open space over more critical infrastructure.
Thank you, Ms. Bongiovanni. As mentioned, that concludes Boston Residents Group questions for this panel.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. We've gone a little bit past our normal morning break. So I guess, why don't we take a 15-minute break right now, and then we'll assess where we are and when it's appropriate to take a lunch break. So why don't we come back at 11:45? Off the record? back on the record. Does anyone else have questions for the panel?
Ms. Sharkey, we do not. No, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenzweig. Does anyone from the bench have questions?
I'm muted. I'm unmuted now. Happy to go first.
Thank you, Mr. Green.
Okay, so why don't we start with the question that Mr. O'Brien was asking before, with the caveat that it be limited to concerns of environmental damage with respect to the company's load forecast. And I'll read the question that was asked previously of Senator Edwards, just to make sure it's the same question, and give the panel a bit more room to answer that question and without the caveat that was discussed previously. So yes, the question would be, as a hypothetical, assume that the company's forecast is correct or could be correct, and that there may be the potential for an outage under the defined conditions in 2024. If that were to occur on a hot summer day, would you view that as relevant to the consideration of environmental justice issues in the community?
I don't know how substantially different my answer would be. It is relevant to the environmental justice concerns because of all the reasons we've already enumerated in terms of the health impacts for a socially vulnerable population such as we have in East Boston and in Chelsea. So not having power is a concern in the context. And I think the real crux of the question is what is the route you take to resolve that that concern, that environmental justice concern of people not having power. And I think a very good real world example of what we're dealing with and has been discussed in this proceedings has been the conversations that Eversource has had with the city of Chelsea in regards to locating diesel generators in the community. And that's an example of we need power, yes, but to then bring in diesel burning generators into the community that has health concerns in it obviously was not acceptable to the city of Chelsea, to the officials there, as has been described by Eversource's representatives. So from a bigger picture, that's a stopgap measure. Nobody expects a bunch of diesel generators to sit in Chelsea forever. It's what Mr. Hallstrom had suggested was a very effective and quick solution. The question is whether these quick and effective solutions are also the most environmentally just solution. And then the same question could be posed to the project as a whole. Is this project the most environmentally just? Is this the most sustainable, or the solution that's in the best public interest? And I think we've made it clear that we're not necessarily in agreement with that, even assuming that the need forecasts were all correct. We might have some disagreements on what is the route to resolving that issue within the context of an environmental justice community.
If I may, Mr. Green, thank you for the question. The one thing that I would add is, well, we certainly don't want environmental justice populations to not have power on a very hot day. The other thing that we need to consider is that many of the folks that are in that environmental justice neighborhood already don't have air conditioning. And so if their power went out, it's not like they're going to be any cooler or with power, because many of these folks still don't have air conditioning or central air conditioning, so their homes are already sufficiently hot. And so, sure, it's great to have power, but it would be even better if there was some equity and folks weren't already, disproportionately burdened with environmental heat.
Thank you. So the testimony that you've provided offers some mentions of the Climate Roadmap Act that was enacted in 2021. And my recollection was that that legislation was enacted after the project change final decision was issued in February of 2021. Is that your recollection as well?
Could you repeat those dates again?
Yes, the project change final decision, if I'm not mistaken, was issued on February 26th or 27th of 2021. And again, my recollection was that the Climate Roadmap Act was enacted and signed into law after that. Is that correct?
That sounds correct. It was signed in March. Rosie, is that?
I believe that's correct. I would like to point out that there was an executive order that was signed into law by Governor Patrick before he left office. I believe that was in 2014. And so that law should have been, that executive order should have been uplifted throughout this process, and it was not. And there were also environmental justice policies that were already enacted that also weren't followed. And lastly, the language access bills by the EFSB and the Department of Energy also weren't enacted throughout the entirety of this process. So those all happened much before the Climate Roadmap Bill.
So with respect to the Climate Roadmap Act, we had some cross-examination last week with the company regarding the effectiveness of that act on the project at the stage we're in right now, which is the certificate of environmental impact that's been requested. And I'd like to get your perspective on what bearing you see the Roadmap Act, now that it has been put into law, as having on the board's review of the certificate.
Not being an attorney, I'm not exactly totally versed in all the intricacies of the law, but it's my understanding that there is language in there that is saying that a cumulative impacts assessment analysis must be done within the context of these procedures. This project has progressed pretty far, but the certificate now is being asked of the EFSB. And so my understanding would be that at this point in time, that certificate was asked for after last March of 2021. So the climate bill would apply to it, I assume, and that my layman's understanding would be that it applies to it, and a cumulative impact assessment of granting all of what the relief that Eversource is asking for would have to be performed.
Ms. Bongiovanni, would you want to add to that?
I agree with John's assessment.
Okay. I have no further questions for the panel.
Does anyone else have questions for the panel? In that case, Mr. Turner, do you have redirect for your witnesses?
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. We do not have redirect examination at this time.
In that case, the panel is excused. We appreciate the fact that you made time in your schedule to provide testimony today.
Thank you so much.
So I believe we have remaining procedural issues to address today. In particular, this is the last day of hearings that's been scheduled, and there's been no reason or request to further extend the hearings. Therefore, do I have a motion for anyone to move into evidence the exhibits that have been marked for identification purposes as information responses and record request responses, as well as the direct testimony of the parties in this proceeding?
So moved, and I would add also the materials we submitted with the petition, initial petition and application. But yes, so moved.
Are there any objections to any of the exhibits being moved into evidence? In that case, we will move those exhibits into evidence at this time. At this point, I would set a briefing schedule. There has been some limited changes in the procedural schedule that was initially sent out in this proceeding. But based on where we are in the proceeding right now, I would propose that we schedule initial simultaneous briefs for July 22nd with reply briefs for August 5th. Do the parties anticipate any issues associated with meeting that schedule?
Residents do not.
Mass DEP does not.
Mr. Turner?
CLF and Greenwoods do not anticipate any issues with July 22nd.
Ms. Sharkey, I don't want to go against the flow of consensus, but that is about a week longer than was provisionally designated or proffered as a potential time frame. And it's my goal to bring this process to fruition for the board's determination as quickly as possible. I asked the question respectfully of why there's been a week extension where we've had really only, in essence, maybe a half a day of additional hearing beyond what was initially anticipated.
Normally, we would expect to have some record request responses, which are still outstanding, to come in. Not that most of those have not already been provided, but there are some. And we did run into a few days on the anticipated end of the hearings, which is why we provided the additional time. And I'm not sure, Mr. Rosenzweig, that the difference of time in terms of the briefs being submitted will necessarily contribute to delay in when we may provide you with a decision in this proceeding, which is what I understand you would be ultimately concerned with.
Well, most assuredly, we are concerned with the decision. We just wanted to put the staff in the best possible position to develop a decision in as timely a manner as possible, and mindful of the 6-month statutory timeframe, which we acknowledge is directory, not mandatory, but directory implies, at least as the SJC has articulated, as a meaningful target that should endeavor to be met. And I was only urging if there was any latitude to advance the schedule for briefing closer to what we had initially understood they would be. This is a little bit more than a week's time extension for what I think has not been a material extension of the schedule as originally designated. If that's not feasible, that's not feasible, but I did want to urge and push for it as much as possible, and leave the discretion with the presiding officer and the staff as to what's reasonable under the circumstances.
I appreciate your concern, and I believe that the extension in the briefing schedule will not unduly delay the receipt of the decision by the parties in this proceeding. But I appreciate your concern.
Thank you.
Is there anything else we need to address before we close the hearing and the record in this proceeding? Seeing none, then I would like to, on behalf of the board, extend our sincere appreciation for the time everybody has taken to put into this proceeding, and in particular for those who are not compensated for their testimony and who are people who are working to fit this into their normal daily lives, and we appreciate that.
Can I also put in a kind word for our interpreters who are not always seen or necessarily heard? They've done an excellent job, and they've been here with us since the very beginning of the proceeding. And so I just want to give them a shout out and thanks.
As well as to our court reporter. Thank you, Mr. Brock. In that case, I anticipating seeing at least the parties at the subsequent board meeting in this proceeding, and hope you all have a good day.
Is it too late for me to share a few words?
I'm afraid it is at this point, but please be assured that everything you've said today and in your pre-filed testimony and in your previous presentations to the board will be taken seriously.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Off the record.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.